Today is the first Sunday in Lent, and during Lent, we'll be looking at the last 7 words of Jesus from the cross. In the Gospel of John, we read Jesus' word, "I thirst." This morning, we will read from selected verses of John 19. So they took Jesus, and carrying the cross by himself, he went out to that place that is called the skull, which in Hebrew is called Golgotha. There they crucified him, and with him 2 others, one on either side, with Jesus between them. When the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they took his clothes and divided them into 4 parts, one for each soldier. They also took his tunic. Now the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece from the top. So they said to one another, "Let us not tear it, but cast lots for it to see who will get it." This was to fulfill what the scripture says. They divided my clothes among themselves, and for my clothing they cast lots. And this is what the soldiers did. Meanwhile, standing near the cross were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. After this, when Jesus knew that all was now finished, he said, in order to fulfill the scripture, "I am thirsty." A jar full of sour wine was standing there. So they put a sponge full of the wine on a branch of hyssop and held it to his mouth. May God bless this reading to our understanding. Today is my first Sunday back after 2 weeks of vacation, and I am deeply grateful to Reverend Katie Smith-Massot and Reverend Ashley Chang, who delivered powerful sermons over the past 2 Sundays. And I have to tell you, it's good to be home. When a Sunday rolls around and I'm not here in church with you, it just never feels quite right. I'm also deeply grateful to Dr. Mike Graves and Reverend Bryce Bowers, both of whom went above and beyond leading this congregation while I was out of the country. I know that you and I share the opinion that we have a fabulous clergy team. I treasure them, and I'm grateful that you treasure them as well. One of the great things about being away on vacation is it gives you time to catch up on some reading, and one of the lovely little novels I read while I was away was called Going Home by Tom Lamont. There's 4 main characters in this little novel, and the 4 main characters form what I think of as an accidental community. There's Teo and his friend Ben. They grew up together, went to school together, stayed friends in their 20s, and now are hitting the mark of 30. And neither one of them has quite gotten life together. They kind of want to. They have a hunch there's something more in life than just partying. But Teo is just now moving out, getting a place of his own, trying to launch his career, and Ben is still piddling away at his large trust fund. Then there's Teo's dad, a widow, now suffering from something that seems like Parkinson's, and mostly he is haunted by the loneliness of each day, of depression and a sense of meaninglessness. And finally, the 4th character in this little accidental community is Sybil. She's the interim rabbi, and yet she feels like her faith is slipping away from her. She has a sense that there is some kind of God in the distance who's still seeing her. But these 4 characters are thrust together at the beginning of the novel with the responsibility to care for an orphan toddler, and not one of them has a clue what to do with this toddler. So the novel exposes all 4 of them with their raw, honest human vulnerability. Each character in the novel, Teo and Ben and Teo's elderly father and Sybil the rabbi, all experience a deep human longing for life to be something that it isn't. They long for things like community and family and self-acceptance and even some nebulous thing they call faith. They thirst for something that is not yet possible. In today's scripture lesson from the Gospel according to John, we read about Jesus saying from the cross, "I am thirsty." Of the 7 words that Jesus says on the cross, I think this one's my favorite. I thirst. You can almost hear Jesus' scratchy throat gasping for air when he says, "I am thirsty." Jesus resonates with the human longing that you and I experience on our beautiful and yet sometimes torturous walk through this journey we call life. Jesus knows firsthand our physical thirst. A few years ago, some of us traveled to the Holy Land with Dr. Mike Graves, and you might remember if you were on that trip that at the front of the bus was this white cooler filled with bottled water, and every time it was refilled with more water, people would rush to the front of the bus to get more water because the Holy Land is a desert landscape. It was swelteringly hot, some days 105. I think one day it was 112. I remember looking at Mike and saying, "Are you sure this is the promised land? I mean, it doesn't feel like the land of milk and honey." Jesus lived in that landscape, only without the tour bus and the bottled water and the cooler. He knew that intense thirst. And you and I know that when you hear on the news that someone was off on a hike and they're lost and they're looking for them, they'll usually report. Now, they can go for some time without food, but water is essential to life. Sometimes we go and see my granddaughter run in the cross-country meet. And at the end, we're at the finish line. We're waiting to give her a fist bump and a high five and a good job, Ella. And she just breezes right past us and goes straight to the team tent to get a squirt of water. And some of us even together, have had that grueling experience of sitting by the bedside of a loved one who is in her final days. And the hospice nurse brings in that little cup of water along with an orange sponge, a little tiny sponge on a stick, and you dip the stick and the sponge into the water and you moisten their lips and give them a little water to drink. Jesus was like us. He had to have something to drink. He had to satisfy his deep thirst. He knew the agony of suffering on the cross without anything to moisten his lips. All 4 Gospels tell us that someone offered him sour wine on a sponge in the final minutes or hours. But only in John's Gospel are we told that Jesus says, "I thirst." The back of his throat parched and dry, his lips chapped. It's hard to swallow. John paints a picture of a Jesus who is human. Earlier in John, we are told something similar. This Jesus wept. He knew the pain of the loss of a friend, and Jesus wept. And earlier we are told that Jesus was tired, was exhausted. He sat down by the side of the well at noon in the heat of the day. He was vulnerable and fragile like us. But secondly, we know Jesus also had a spiritual thirst. Too often, I think, we picture Jesus as God, as God's Son, as the Messiah, as this one who is somehow supernatural, extraordinary, divine, always forgiving, ultimately compassionate, a miracle worker. And in admiring that one that we put up on a pedestal, we sometimes forget that Jesus was human like us. His heart broke as our heart breaks. Do you ever really imagine Jesus depressed, anxious, frustrated, angry, disillusioned? When I was about 20 years old, I was toying with the idea of going into full-time service in the church. Maybe I would even go to seminary. Maybe I would become a minister. But deep down, I knew that I was not worthy of such a calling. But then I spent 2 summers working for my friends Gary and Linda Walling in Houston, Texas. They were co-pastoring a church together there in Houston, and I was privileged to serve as their summer intern for 2 summers. Sometimes during those summers, I even lived in their home. But even when I was living elsewhere, there were times when we spent together 8 hours a day, sometimes 10, sometimes 12 hours a day. We worked side by side for that church. And during those summers, I learned so much about the church, about ministry, about myself. But the most important lesson I learned was that Gary and Linda were human beings with flaws, and they were fabulous ministers. And so I decided that if you could be a minister and carry with you all your human frailties, then maybe I could be one too. For that, I have always been grateful to them because they showed me that vulnerability was not just a flaw, but a gift. In the recent Netflix hit, I don't know if you've seen it yet, it's been out a couple of months, it's called One Day. There are these 2 characters, Emma and Dexter, and they play a day in Emma and Dexter's life on July 15th every year for 20 years. They meet at college graduation, and they couldn't be more opposite. Dexter is a well-to-do, from a very privileged family, party guy. He's just out to have a good time. He's wild. And Emma is from a working class family. She's a very serious student, very academic, intellectual, focused, very creative. But they befriend each other at graduation, and we see their friendship unfolding on that same day, year after year. But we are able to see what they keep hidden from one another. They refuse to be completely vulnerable with each other. They will not play their cards with each other. They keep their genuine affection, their deep love for one another hidden because vulnerability is too risky. The audience can see their real feelings, but they keep them hidden from each other to their own detriment. On the cross, when Jesus says, "I thirst," he invites us to be vulnerable, to be honest. When Jesus says, "I thirst," we meet a living God who could be of some use to us while we thirst for our lives to be different. This is the kind of Jesus who goes with a friend to get her chemo infusions. This is the Jesus who is with us when we wake up in the middle of the night feeling absolutely hopeless. This is the Jesus who knows your feeling of helplessness when you're at Micah Ministry trying to help a man who's living on the streets of Kansas City find a pair of gloves that fit his extra large hands. This is the Jesus who is with our military generals, our Veterans Administration doctors, our legislators, who long and thirst for peace. This is the Jesus who knows that the joy of resurrection comes by the way of the cross. Jesus' thirst reveals the God who comes alongside of us in our human suffering, and ultimately this is what will be the path of redemption. But now, here's the startling part of Jesus' thirst for me. It doesn't really make sense, because it is in this very same Gospel of John that Jesus will describe himself as the living water. This is the amazing story of John, where in the middle, Jesus encounters a woman at the well, a woman who is an outcast, who is a foreigner, who is of a different religion. And Jesus says to her, I am the living water. Anyone who drinks of me will never, ever, ever thirst. And in this same gospel, we meet Jesus on the opening pages of John as the one who goes to a wedding feast and finds all these barrels of water and turns them into wine, a joyous picture. And yet this vulnerable man on the cross who says, I thirst, is the very presence of God's overflowing divine love. How does this make sense? It baffles me. But the theologian Stanley Hauerwas writes about this tension with eloquence. He says, God thirsts for us. God desires for us to desire God. We were created to thirst for God. On the cross, then, we hear God's longing, God's desire, God's vulnerable love for us, for you, for me, for all of humanity. The divine God thirsts for us. God is not abstract. God is accessible. God is fragile and down to earth and vulnerable and weak and intimate. Therefore, we cannot remain aloof because we are invited into this divine love with the Jesus who says, I thirst. But maybe it's better told with a story. Late in that novel that I mentioned a moment ago, the novel called Coming Home, there is this scene where those two 30-something-year-old friends, Ben and Teo, are trying to master the art of putting a toddler to sleep at night. Neither of these young men really has a clue what to do. They don't know the first thing about loving a child, about raising a child. Neither signed up for the job, not sure they really want to do this. But Teo is trying to teach his buddy Ben how to put the little toddler to sleep at night. And so Teo says, come in, watch. I'm going to show you. And he tucks the little toddler in behind the covers, tucks him tightly in, gets his pillow just right, his stuffed animals just right. And then Teo lays down next to the toddler and he pats his back. And then he whispers to Ben, now don't move too soon, because if you do, he will sit straight up in the bed and you will start the whole routine all over again. And so Ben asks, how do you know if it's happening for real? And Teo says, sleep. You watch until the breathing rhythm shifts. And Ben says, no. I mean, how do you know when you've started to love them or not?